There's a microphone there, please.
Do I need a microphone? Can everyone hear all right? Or are we good without it? I'm used to Bellerin.
You folks okay?
Born in the field.
It might be wise if you do that because there might be a
Just to use it? Okay.
Just turn it on, it should work.
Oh, we got
You-
technical stuff. Okay, are we working?
You have to almost eat it. You almost have to eat the mic.
Okay, is this a little better? Thank you for having me here this afternoon. I'm Jake Groner. I'm with the Columbiana and Fairfield Township Historical Society. Was asked to present the Firestone Park in its beginnings for the first 25 years from Columbiana. All of us are familiar with Firestone Park. There's probably no one in here that has not been to the park for a reunion or a picnic or just for a sporting event. The information I've got is from the old ledgers that are on microfilm at the Columbiana Library. Also, there are online sources that I've used through the Leper Library for the Lisbon Journal, the Morning Journal, the Evening Journal, the Vindicator, and the Salem News, and also from the Historical Society in Columbiana. And what? Yep, that's what I figured. Dr. Trader was a new doctor in town in the 1920s, and he touted, of all things, physical fitness for the youth, because they weren't getting outside and moving around as much as he thought they would. This is 1920, 100 years ago, kind of a novel idea, right? Well, he advocated having some type of outdoor exercises. So the first recruit was the fire department, because they had access to hose and water. So every noon during the summer, the bell would clang at the fire station, and that would call all the kids down to the corner of Pittsburgh Street and South Elm Street, where the old high school, as we knew it, used to be. And for 2 hours, the firemen would spray the kids down. Well, like anything, if you do it often enough, it turns into work. So actually, the fire department was the first organization that tried to get something more permanent put into town. Their first thought was, and again, this is not going to be cute. Their first thought was right off of Fairfield Avenue. If any of you were familiar with Columbiana on Duquesne Street, where Dickey's cement is, that area had an artesian well and a little creek running through it. Their thought was, let's dam this up and we can make a nice little pond. It can be bathed in the summertime because there was fresh supply of water. In the wintertime, and you could ice skate on it and put a couple picnic tables. That way, we don't have to stand in 2 hours every Saturday and hose the kids down. Other sites were considered during that time. One of them, when Harvey Firestone found out about it, and again, I apologize for my computer's temperament this afternoon. Harvey had just acquired land on East Park Avenue, east of town. Our city limits was right about where the railroad track was at that time. And he got a hold of Doc Trader and he said, round up some guys with like thinking as you and meet me over in Akron. Well, right after Christmas in 1933, the troop got in a sedan of Doc Trader's and went over to Akron to meet with Mr. Firestone. At that meeting, they came back with the promise of Harvey's acreage that he had, 52 acres, and he would donate that plus $5,000 in seed money to get things started. Well, they came home all excited about this. They had a place and they had some seed money. They got a hold of W.O. Wallace was a solicitor at that time. He got in touch with federal agencies. We're coming right out of the Depression right now. This is 1933/34, real close. They got federal monies lined up, they got the land, and they got seed money going. They even had a preliminary drawing of the entire acreage, all within 1 week. So this was the first park board that was set up, where the like-minded citizens of Columbiana with Doc Trader was Ray Miller, Dan Miller, Ray Fisher, and Dick Fitzpatrick, who comprised the first park board because they were the ones that went over and got the land from Mr. Firestone. They also solicited the Civil Works Organization, which helped people and communities at that era coming out of the Depression. The minutes here of the meeting, one of the 16 meetings they held in the first 2 weeks, that they took these minutes and turned them into the WPA so they would have an outline of what they proposed to do with the funds if they should come from the federal agencies. And these men oversaw everything. Here we have, and I think I can use this cursor. Yep, that'll show. This is actually the ditch line where the duck pond would be eventually. But this is preliminary excavation. These 5 gentlemen were out there constantly walking the grounds and making sure that everything was being constructed right. There's no big machinery. Everything was done with horse-drawn implements for grading all of the roads and grading everything, even building up the pool, the hill for the pool to be put on. If you can see in the background here, this is the beginnings of the pool at the top of that hill. And right here, kind of hard to see because of the size of it, is an old barn. That old barn was brought out to the park property and used to store the materials, the piping, lead, everything else that they needed in constructing the park. That'll come up in a little bit. See if I can, not figuring me out. One of the first donations we had in kind was from a Tom Highland. He was a water well driller, and he drilled this well in front of what would become our new pavilion that we have. It was a shelter going in at this time, but it was the very first structure in the park to be built. He got down about 175 feet and got 2,000 gallons an hour, which was good enough for a pavilion, but he said that water tested even better than the water that the city or the village was putting in the water lines for everyone's consumption. Of the 52 acres, Mr. Firestone kept on reserve the front hill. Now the front hill went from entrance to entrance on Park Avenue, about 5 acres of land, and he kept that in reserve for a burial place for himself because Columbiana Cemetery was running out of room. Well, during this time, Columbiana officials were dealing with a landowner just east of the cemetery. And there were about 18 acres that they were trying to buy, and they finally succeeded in getting that. They offered that to Mr. Firestone, the entire thing, whatever he wanted for his memorial. And he, seeing that he would be closer to his family across the street, ended up taking that property to develop it, but he also donated all of this property to the park so it could be developed for regular park purposes. The little pink lines that you can see through there are the actual gravel walkways that were laid out through that before all the latest renovations went through. And I'm sure when they dug that up, what is this? I'm sure when they dug that up, that they still got gravel in their shovels and everything, because we would dig in through, when I was at the park, started in 1969 with the Parks Department and then was the manager from 80 to 94. And everybody turns to me when they get stuck with something like, what's this pipe go to? Because I pretty much turned up a bunch of the park. Here again, come on, minutes thinking. Here again, the park board oversaw, as I said, everything, with all the constant meetings and everything they had. Now these 5 men were businessmen. They had their businesses they had to attend to all day. So their park board meetings did not start until 9 or 10 o'clock every night once they closed their businesses down. And they would drag on until 2, 3, maybe 4 o'clock in the morning, trying to take care of the business of the park. Then they get up the next morning and do their business again and probably have another meeting the next night. So there was very little sleep in the first few months, if not the first few years, for these gentlemen. In March of 1935, the pool was released to be built from Columbus with funds, which was good because everything was done except the floor of the pool. The walls were already excavated and they were already poured. And at that time, they just had to complete the floor and some decking. So by June, they turned all of their attention to the bathhouse to get it done. Didn't take long at all for the pool to come. That was one of the first structures built there. One of the first athletic courts were the tennis courts. And these were clay at the time. So after every tennis match, they had to be drugged, watered, and rolled to make sure that they were ready for the next set to come on. Well, this cost money, so they had to hire somebody to oversee this and to get all the money. It was 10 cents a game to play, but that took care of the courts. It was all taken care of through those small funds. They put Jimmy Wyant, who was an athletic director and a coach at Columbiana, and he oversaw all the sports fields. So if you wanted to have a football game or a baseball game or anything, you had to go through him. One of the drawings, and this is from, as you can see the little sticker in the corner here, this is from the archives of the Historical Society, and this is a thumbnail drawing. The gentleman went up to Cleveland, to Municipal Stadium, and they got in touch with the groundkeeper up there, who gave them the dimensions, and they wrote this down on what was little more than a napkin, and brought it back, and they presented it to Mr. Firestone, and said, we would like to build this for the baseball diamond. He said, well, if it's good enough for the Cleveland Indians, it's good enough for Firestone Park in Columbiana. So these were the dimensions that they used to have architects draw permanent drawings for the park, for the baseball field, excuse me. June of 35, the pool opened. It was 10 cents for kids to swim up through 14 years old, 25 cents, or 20 cents, excuse me, for adults. And it came to the attention of the park board that some children couldn't afford 10 cents to go swimming. So 3 days a week, they would allow free swimming at the pool for 2 hours for those under 14 years old that couldn't afford even the 10 cents. The entire pool was built for $60,000 originally, 300,000 gallon pool. And we couldn't even replace one of the filters for that in today's money. Mr. Firestone would call meetings. It took about an hour and a half, 2 hours to get here from Akron. So he would call up Doc Trader and say, get the boys together, we're gonna have a meeting, meet me at noon at the farmhouse. So Harvey would get in his car and drive to Columbiana. On his way to and from, they would always meet, or usually would meet, out at the farmhouse where his birthplace was, Firestone Farms. On his way to there and leaving at times, he had a favorite spot on the upper road. The pillar's right in the middle, so I was trying to dodge back and forth here to get everyone's eye. His favorite spot was dubbed as Harvey's Lookout, and it's commemorated now with a big boulder with a plaque on it. But if you can imagine, when the park was first built, the trees weren't much bigger than your thumb, and they were maybe 6 foot tall. He could stand at that one vantage point, and he could look at the pool and then sweep around to see the lower duck pond and the pavilions. All the sports fields went around, and the pavilions being built on the other side of the park. So as efficient as he was, he could take this all in only a few minutes and catch up really quick with stuff. Things weren't real smooth all the time for the build. In fact, early on, Mr. Firestone got upset one morning when he saw the original plans drawn up. And he called Doc Trader, says, get the boys over here as soon as you can get here. We need to have a meeting. He didn't give him much more information than that, so it was a long couple-hour drive over there, like, what is this about? And when he got there, Mr. Firestone closed the door to his office, had them then sit down, and he looked at him. He said, gentlemen, when we first started talking about this, there were certain stipulations, and a lot of them I wanted you to follow my lead on this and carry through my wishes and where I want things placed. Oh yes, sir, we understand. You know, we are doing everything to your wishes. We don't understand what you mean. Well, for the pool, for instance, I wanted that pool out front against, at the time, Route 14, the Cox Highway was East Park Avenue. He says, you've got it tucked in the back that no one can see it. He said, if you can't do any better than this, I'm gonna pull the plug on the whole project. And he was that close to it. Well, the guys got back in their sedan, and it was an awful long, quiet ride back to Columbiana. In the meantime, while they were on their way, Mr. Firestone called in his architects to go over the plans they were issued. He did find out with their review that the pool was where he had proposed it to be, to overlook Park Avenue and the Cox Highway at the time. That what he'd mistaken for the pool was actually a football field. So when the guys got back to Columbiana, Mr. Firestone, being the man of integrity that he was, he called up as Doc Trader. And he said, I've made a terrible mistake. He says, you guys are following everything that I set forth and that we discussed. He says, I apologize profusely. I'm just a dumb tire builder. I can't read plans like you guys obviously can. And he's just to show you how bad I feel about this whole situation, he kicked another $2,000 into the bill right at that spot. So he was a man of integrity and owned up to mistakes that he made over time. But just to give you an insight to his character. Now at some of these meetings when they met out at Firestone, he would meet around noontime, so they would have a late lunch. The housekeeper, Mrs. Sansenbar, would make a late lunch for him and they'd have it at the dining room table. And when lunch was over, they'd start discussing park things. And some of the discussions got pretty lively in as how things should be created or where they should be put. And to emphasize this, Mr. Firestone pulled out his ink pen and started drawing on the linen tablecloth. Well, his housekeeper threw a fit. My goodness, I understand it's yours, but still, you're ruining perfectly good. Unfortunately, because of that housekeeper's good housekeeping skills, all of those ink stains washed out, so we have no records of those dining room table discussions that happened. But her granddaughter still carries those stories with them in the Sansenbar family. Even Ohio Bell, got into it. Their part was, there was a line from Park Avenue straight back to a farmhouse that at that time, today would be on Parkview Drive. Right at the bottom of the Pool Hill, cutting right in the middle of the property. They upped all of their lines and took them clear to the east property line and went down behind where the pavilions are, where the maintenance shed is, and where the hardball field is, down around to the girls softball field today, where that still exists. And how come you're doing this to me? Start it again? No, we're at the same spot. I have no idea. There's spooks in this computer. Anyway, at no cost, they moved that line the whole way around so there wouldn't be any wires through the park. And I got the little wheel that's telling me it's thinking about things. That would be the pregnant pause coming up right now. The and then it takes off. 1936, the second year the pool was open, the admission was adjusted just slightly. 10 cents would now get you in swimming if you were still in high school. So they bumped it up about 4 or 5 years, so everyone in school. Or you could buy a strip of 10 tickets for 80 cents. Get in maybe a little cheaper. 25 cents now for adults to get in. They put, if those of us who swam the pool when I managed it, in a brisk 56-degree temperature that water comes out of the ground, they put steam pipes in this year to try to warm it up just a little bit. But unfortunately, because they had to let kids go swimming in it, the steam pipes were very temporary in trying to warm that up, and it didn't last either. 36, a new shelter was built, and again, in the background, you can see the top of the hill where the pool was being built, and now we have a little bit of a football stadium that's going in too. The new shelter had no sides to it. It was just an open shelter with a roof over it and a grill at one end for your hamburgers and hot dogs. The original shelter wasn't as big as number 1 pavilion, as that white pavilion was. It has the roadway going the whole way around at the north end of the duck pond. It was enlarged then later, but this was the size of it originally. So at the end of 1936, things that were accomplished that year was plantings on the front hill, as it was now dedicated as park property, and all the new trees that they put around the pool to provide a little bit of shade, to the lament of a pool manager that I was 40 years after this, and all those pine needles kept going into the pool, and that was not well thought out. That was Mr. Allen DeForest was a landscape architect, and he was from Rochester, New York. Very world renowned, and Mr. Firestone used him on all of these personal properties too, and developing his golf courses and the other parks that bear the Firestone name. So he got himself around a lot. He tried to get to some of those meetings, but an hour and a half wouldn't get him here from Rochester, so he had to have at least a day's notice from Mr. Firestone to those meetings. August of '36, an attendance record was put of 1,200 people, over 1,200 people. And all of this, if you can imagine, just the size of the pool and only 2 lifeguards at that point. During that hot spell when this record was set, the state health department decided to knock on the door and do a health inspection with it. And they found everything was just exactly as it was planned. In fact, they said any other community that was interested in building a pool such as this to come to Firestone Park, because it is the epitome of a modern and sanitary swimming facility. In fact, the park took that with a little bit of advertising. Come on in, we're state approved now. Everything's good with the state, and we have picnic facilities. We have everything you need right in Columbiana. You don't have to drive miles and miles away or to a big city to enjoy what we have here locally. Well, the very first year, we just built our new shelter, and the park board had a meeting there. And the evening, they grilled some hamburgers and hot dogs on that little grill at the end. And the very next morning, about 4:30, there was a newspaper boy that was delivering in the neighborhood, and he looked over and noticed there was smoke coming out of the roof of the new pavilion. So he turned his bike around, went right up to the police department, got a hold of the firemen, and came out and put the fire out. Here, there was wood right up against the chimney, and they had such a hot fire that it caught that wood on fire. It was only a couple $100 worth of damage, but boy, did the park board take heat for trying to burn down their brand new shelter. And it wasn't even a summer old yet. That winter, if I can hold this, stay. It was reported to council that there were a horde of rats that have overtaken the bathhouse because all of the fertilizer, the peat moss, the grass seed, everything was stored in there over the winter time. Well, council wasn't going to sit with it, so they got in touch with the park board, who on a cold Sunday morning before church services started, all these park board members showed up with garden rakes and hose and shovels, and they had a little teenage boy with a burlap sack that just wouldn't stay still, kept moving around. Well, it was all the park board members, and they invited Dwight Graham with them. Dwight had a pet ferret. The idea was to loose that ferret inside the bathhouse, and it would go everywhere the rats had tunneled out and made, and run the rats outside while they'd be poised there with their rakes and their hose, and they were going to dispatch every little vermin that came out of that place. Well, the little ferret did its job. It went in and its tail disappeared into the middle of everything. And you heard skirmishes happening inside, and the men were standing there poised with their rakes and they're ready to go, and out shot 2 rats and a bunny rabbit with the ferret. None of them even came close to even trying to dispatch a hair on any of them, and they all made their safety away from the park anyway, or away from the bathhouse at that point. But they had quite a conversation at the barber shop for the next few weeks about their great big adventure. New shelters or pavilions, new pavilions started showing up, such as this pavilion. And right out front, this is number 2, the second one built. That's how they got their numbers. But this had a well dug in front of it also, would seat about 120 people inside, and had a fireplace at both ends. One end for cooking, the other end for light and heating. The same with the third pavilion that was built out there. Slightly different roof on it, but it was the same footprint inside, and it also had a well that was right out front. Drainage for the entire park was directed toward the duck pond. Remember that ditch line that you saw earlier? That was actually the under drain for the entire duck pond. When it was first laid out, the thought was every year or two, they would drain it down completely and then scrape out all the muck that the fish and the ducks and everything else, and then use that for topsoil to help top dress and grow grass. Well, it was great in theory. I don't know that that ever happened. There was also, in the south end of that, this whole area is big enough that they thought, they even proposed, we'll drain it down every summer, clean it out, and then girls can play softball on that because it's big enough for a softball field. Don't know that that ever happened either. It was up into the 70s before it was drained down completely to start cleaning it out. By then, the muck was pretty thick. And no, we didn't use it at the park. Farmers were happy with it though. That first year, they let 5 ducks out on the duck pond. And evidently they liked it there because that fall they collected 35 ducks. The first aquacade was in August of 1938 of all the bathing beauties from Columbiana that was tried to get people in for a different venue. Instead of just sitting there and swimming around, they actually were doing synchronized stuff in the pool. That was the very first year that we had an aquacade. And Mr. Firestone, on what would be his last visit, and I hate to touch this again because I know it's going to take off on me, stood at his, no, wait a minute. He stood at his lookout spot on the upper road, and he was very pleased with what he saw. As he looked out there, he was with the 5 original members of the park board, and he said, when you first drew this idea to me, little did I realize that I would be standing in this spot and gazing on this as being developed. I'm proud to have this park bear my name. So now we're 2 frames. Come on, computer. That was the one I just described. Well, we had another attendance record in 1938, and also new things were happening at the park. Instead of just having a swimming hole, they decided they needed something extra, like entertainment. So they invited Columbiana Band, and they invited New Waterford, Leetonia, all of the surrounding communities, along with the American Legion Band and the Lutheran Band out of Youngstown. These would be attended by up to 1,000 people every Sunday evening that they would have these concerts. So that was becoming quite a draw. In 1938, again, the first swing set was put in. And this isn't where the swing sets are now. This is actually where the basketball court is. That was the very first playground area where they put in tether balls and had a volleyball net and swings that would not pass our OSHA regulations by any stretch today because they had 12-inch links on the chain. That very first end, going back, stop it. Going back to the swing sets, the American Legion was the first one that donated toward the swing sets and playground at that point. And they gave $125, which evidently bought an entire swing set and put a couple other amenities there too. This was 1938. That very first year for the ice skating, when we first opened it up, there were over 600 skaters that attended the first day. In fact, the 34 days of ice skating, there were over 6,500 people that went ice skating there. And to keep warm, the pavilion wasn't right there, right at the duck pond. It was that open shelter that was just north of it with no walls. So they ended up, through the season, hanging canvas on the sides, and they kept the fire going. Luckily, they had it constructed right that it didn't burn down from all that heat, but they kept the fire going in that constantly to try to get people warmed up. things weren't as luxurious as they were now, where you just walk up to a pavilion and sit inside with the potbelly. The 1939, this annual report went to the Works Progress Administration, and it gave a synopsis on what they'd accomplished that year. And so they could justify coming back and getting more money the next year. They put over 3,000 lineal feet that year of the brick troughs that were on both sides to carry water away. They also had over 5,000 plantings of 95 different species of plants. And you can stay there or go? No, you're gonna go. It all told up that there were $3,800 or $38,000 spent of Uncle Sam's money in 1938, and only $18,000 of local money, and a lot of that was in-kind stuff, and majority of it came from Mr. Firestone, because it was all of his horses and all his wagons that helped build everything. So it was kind of an in-kind donation by Mr. Firestone. Here is one. There were 2 pages to this. The city only has one now, but this is the original planting list of all of Mr. DeForest's plants that he put in the park. Not only what their Latin name was, what their common name was, their caliper, and how many there were of each species. Now that we have a duck pond, we have to have swans. So the park board went out and got 2 swans to put on, and also warned everybody as they released them that spring to give them a little room, because swans are very territorial, and you don't want to muck with a swan as she's sitting on a nest, because the dad will be there too to ward you off. And you can't just release swans. We have to name everything that we put in the park. Well, meet Clark and May from Clark Gable and May West, popular people at that time. And the very first year they had 6 little cygnet swans. So they liked the duck pond also. 1940 now, and number 4 pavilion, the last of the pavilions were built. The sandstone that these pavilions were built from was from Firestone Park's own quarry on Route 164, just north of Lisbon. There was land down there that they found sufficient building material, and they made a lease for it and kept that lease for about 6-8 years until they were done building everything. And that's all of the original sandstone around the duck pond came from down there too. Now that the pond or the park itself was being completed, more of a completed state, they started enclosing the number 1 pavilion, the very first pavilion, and putting walls up and doors. So it was more sheltered and could be used later into the year. They stocked the lake with fish and started building open shelters. In fact, there were 4 of them that were built in the original design. And again, we have a very giving community, and they thought to enhance the park and get more people into the park, well, let's put some birds out there. So Mr. Basinger, who was a florist on North Main Street, and this is, don't stop it if you go one more. Anyway, he loved birds, and he donated these pheasants. These are Chinese golden pheasants, Mongolian silver pheasants, along with regular ringneck pheasants. He not only donated the birds, but he also donated a pheasant coop. And this was in the northeast part of the, where the lake is. If you're familiar with the park now, where the pillars are, that Ms. Tingle helped build, right in that area, just northeast of the duck pond, figuring that people could pull up along the side of the road and look at them, or even get out of their cars. But it would give more people into the park, because parks need a gimmick. You can't just have grass, I guess. Well, 1940, in June, the park was deemed pretty much done, but the WPA carried on. In fact, all those workers that were working in the park just moved across the street, and they started grading all the roads and developing. Remember the new acreage that they got, that they donated to Mr. Firestone? He got a design that he agreed with, and they started putting all the roads and plantings and everything across the street into the cemetery. We still, okay, I just wait every frame to make sure this doesn't take off on me. Now we have something else at the pool. We have the old steel water slide that was put in at first. And another record was set with almost 1,600 people that attended that pool in one day. Again, 2 lifeguards cleared this part. And they were helped out every once in a while by Superintendent Kopic, but he was out and about doing the rest of the stuff in the park and couldn't devote full time to the pool. This is a resuscitator that was first used on Charlie Fullerton in town. He was a 13-year-old that went under, or excuse me, Charlie Fullerton was a lifeguard. A 13-year-old from here, from Petersburg, went over, and I don't have her name, but went in the deep end of the pool. It was recognized that she was struggling and couldn't get out, and they brought her up and put her on the side. They resuscitated her for about 15 minutes. She made a full recovery. They called Doc Trader in, and they transported her to Salem, put her in an oxygen tent overnight, but she did make a full recovery. So that was the first near issue that we had with the pool. Meanwhile, my computer went blank again. We had a tragedy that really happened down at the duck pond. As soon as this decides it's going to come up. It was discovered that Clark Swan got run over by a car on the road right beside the duck pond. Are you going to switch it or not? Anyway, they never did find who ran over the Swan, but it was obviously hit by a car. That winter, they took May up to Crandall Park to go with the other swans and wildlife that were wintered up at Crandall Park from Mill Creek. And that lasted until the next spring, when it was a case of mistaken identity. Here, it wasn't Clark that got run over, it was May that had been hit. And they knew that because Clark was up there trying to win the woos of all the female swans in Crandall Park. And they told Kopic, come up there and get your birds, as he's disrupting life up here. Get them back on their own duck pond. The very first Easter egg hunt was held in 1941. It was the summer recreation program that put it on. There were 25 dozen eggs that were colored by the girls that were running that and guys. And they had 75 pounds of candy that they had hidden that very first year. And again, being part of a giving community, we had Mr. Fullerton, Harry Fullerton, that ran a gas station in town. His son just helped resuscitate that young lady from Petersburg here. And he liked to hunt, so he went to Canada and he was very successful at it. And he shot himself a moose, brought it home, had the head stuffed. And that's when his wife put her foot down. He said, there's no way there's going to be a dead animal's head in my house, period. Well, he didn't want to relegate it to his garage because the fumes and the dirt and everything from working on cars. So, hey, Park, do you want a moose head? So he donated this along in subsequent years to actually 3 different moose heads that he donated to the park. On that same line, and under live animals, we had a T.A. Mercer that was from here, from Petersburg. He was a snake collector and would go down to Florida every winter and he would collect non-venomous snakes. Well, he brought 50 of them home this year and he couldn't get rid of them all. He tried to sell them, and that was his little business that he had. Well, they wouldn't sell, so hey, Park, you want some snakes? And it included the hognose snake, the indigo racer, a pine snake. And he not only did that, but he built a little shelter for him. So now Mr. Kopic has to figure out how to take care of snakes too, other than mowing grass and taking care of pavilions. It just, people and their donations and figuring that the park needed things like this. It tried to make a roadside stop and get more people to stop in. Well, feeling awful sorry for Clark Swan, The boiler company employees took up a collection in their own boiler down there, and they raised $40. They wanted to get a mate for Clark to go back on the duck pond. So not knowing how far $40 goes in the world of swans, they ended up buying two. So meet after the 1950s now, but this is George and Gracie. So they really didn't know how Clark was going to react when they turned him loose on the duck pond. Mr. Kopic went down and he opened the cage, and the two plopped into the lake on the west side of the lake. Well, nothing happened on Clark's pond without Clark knowing about it. Well, as soon as they hit the water, he was on the opposite side, and he hit the water at the same time and swam straight across the duck pond to him. And everyone was holding their breath collectively, like, what is going to erupt here? And he swam up to him, and after just a brief encounter, he opened up his wings and just greeted him into his new duck pond, into their new facility, and took him around a tour to all the bushes where they could sleep, and everything about the little innuendos of the duck pond. Well, that went great for about 2 days, and then all of a sudden, Clark wanted Gracie to himself and didn't want to share with George. So according to the article in the Ledger, it took 3 strong men and a thick rope to separate Clark from the group and put him in solitary confinement. That same article had for sale 1 large male swan. Contact Mr. Kopic with the park. He was sold, and he did live out his life in a nearby farm that they had bought, or they had purchased. The Columbiana Kiwanis Club met regularly. In fact, all of the civic organizations did. And they had to drag a flag with them everywhere they went. So they ended up donating a flag to each of the pavilions. So it didn't matter which pavilion they wanted to meet at, they would be ready. Well, George and Gracie matured well over the summer. In fact, people were amazed at George's almost 7-foot wingspan. And he was using that wingspan. He would take off and fly around the duck pond and then come back and land and make a great big stream in his landing. And people were really impressed with it until one morning when Mr. Kopic went down to feed him, and Gracie was the only one there. Later that morning, he got a phone call. It was the county game warden. He says, come and get your swan. It's down here at the county fairgrounds in Lisbon. So it took off in French leave that night. He got him back. Well, this isn't going to happen again. This is August now. They clipped his wings. In fact, they got a hold of Gracie, and they clipped her wings too. Well, not everybody knows how long it takes for pin feathers to grow back out on the swan. So right before they were getting ready to be collected for that winter, to be winterized again, Mr. Kopic went down the duck pond and there was no swans there. His first reports came from up in Poland and Struthers. We think we see your swans, there are 2 big white birds on my pond. So Mr. Kopic got in his car. This is right now the beginning of World War II, just put things in perspective. He went up to Struthers, and then he drove over to Poland, and then other sightings that happened around, and finally he was out of gas ration tickets, and this is only the beginning of December. He had another 20 days to go, and he couldn't go anywhere with his family because he's wasted among these birds. Well, he went home and started dialing the phone then. He contacted every police department between here and pretty much Lake Erie and schools, which was kind of brilliant. He got in touch with schools and he said, tell your bus drivers while they're out in the rural areas, if they happen to see a couple swans on a pond, let me know. We'll come up and we'll get them. The last report they got was up in Pymatuming Lake. And there was not, he went up there after that and they were not there by the time he got there. There were no other reports of anybody ever seeing him. So that by that time, it was the end of December and winter was setting in pretty quick. So to use that for gas ration, Firestone Park, this is your gas ration solution. You don't even have to fire up the car. You can walk there if you're within distance, but you can save money by going locally. You don't have to go to all these big exotic places. We got it all right at Firestone Park. And now it's still thinking about itself. Honest to goodness, I apologize for the attitude of my computer. A new record was set as soon as it decides to go there, okay, for attendance. The very first day was 866 people in 1944. That very night, they shut the pool down and it was closed for the next 2 weeks. Here it developed quite a leak and they would not hold water initially. They found the leak to be in the bottom of the filters. If anyone is familiar with the old gravity sand filters, they're a pit, 8 foot wide, 8 foot deep, and 8 foot deep this way too. All of that had to be bucketed out in a 5-gallon bucket with a rope going up through a small manhole on the deck. There were 3 of those down in the basement. They had to take out all of them. They broke out, and look at this, they broke out the base of that and then re-poured it with new water stop in, and then had to put all of that sand and gravel back in, and that all happened within 2 weeks. So by the end of June, they were up and running again, which is a lot of labor, a lot of hand labor to take care of. One of the first issues that we had at the park as far as someone getting hurt was Sam Greiner, who was a little local teenager, and we had a 10-foot dive in the middle of the top. In fact, this, you can see it right in the middle there. A combination of wet steps with wooden treads, no less, and wet feet, and a game of tag. And he was almost up to the top of the 10-foot, and he slipped on the ladder and started going down, still holding on to the railings on both sides. He looked down to see where he was going to land and caught a step right across his forehead. So after that 4-inch gash was sewn up by Doc King, he was not allowed to swim for the next few weeks until the stitches came out. That's the first report of a severe injury at the pool. In October 1946, actually October 11th, so we're coming right up on the anniversary of that, was the new lighting at the football field was put in. And Columbiana entertained Canfield that night and whooped them 32-0 in front of 1,500 fans in the stands. The very next night, October 12th of 1946, was the very first 6-man football team with New Waterford beating Fairfield Comets at that one, and there were over 600 fans at that, but that was the first night game in the state of Ohio for a 6-man football team. In June 30, 1950, Richard Earl was a 12-year-old boy that was with his aunt from Salem, and his aunt brought him down to go swimming at the pool. She paid for him at the ticket booth, and then she went around the north end to go sit on some bleachers to watch him. When she got there, she couldn't find him. So she caught a hold of the lifeguard that was right there, who was Bob Hum, Attorney Hum in Columbiana, his father. Got his attention, and he said, he's probably dawdling in the locker room yet. So we went in the locker room to see if he was still in there putzing around. He wasn't in there. In fact, the basket boy that used to take your clothes and put them in a basket, and he, oh yeah, I remember him, he's here, there's his basket right there. So with that, immediately Bob ran back out and cleared the pool. They found the little boy in the bottom of the deep end, and what eyewitnesses had said, they had seen him or noticed him running down the ramp from the locker room, threw his towel right at the end of the railing, and then went right over, not knowing how to swim, and dove into 8 foot of water. They pulled him out, they used a resuscitator on him. Doc King came out to the pool again, and they pronounced him dead. This is the only death that we've had at Firestone Park, at the pool. Well, to keep that from not ever happening again, that very next year, the park board instituted free public, or not free, but public swim lessons for everyone. The cost was the price of admission, 20 cents a day, but on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, all the Columbiana children could go out there. On Tuesday, Leetonia children, and on Thursday, we'd entertain North Lyman children to have swim lessons, so we would not have another tragedy like we had the year before that. This is 51, and the park board decided they were going to commemorate Mr. Firestone. If you remember me describing his lookout and where he stood, of all places but Firestone Avenue in Columbiana, a basement was being dug. And one of the park board members noticed this great big pink granite boulder. And he asked the homeowner if he would be willing to donate it to the city. He says, you can get it out of here, you can have it. Well, this thing weighs almost 3 tons. So we got the street department to go down and pick it up, and they transported it out there, put it as close as they could for memory to where Harvey's Lookout was. They commissioned the local foundry, and they made the plaque to put on it, commemorating not only Harvey's generosity, but also the first park board members that were put on. Now we're up to 53 in the Korean War, and the Ground Observant Corps. We had our own, every little burg in the United States had their own Ground Observance Corps. This was ours. It was in the pool parking lot, and it was just a platform about 6 foot high, and then above that was a small shelter, only big enough for maybe 2 people. If you got more than that, you weren't going to dance at all. The outside would be patrolled, and any airplane that would come overhead, they were schooled. All of the people, we had over 100 people in Columbiana that were in the Ground Observance Corps that put in a few hours every week looking to the sky. There weren't that many planes, as many as there are today, but any plane they would be schooled on the silhouette so they could tell what type of plane it was. And on the inside of the roof here of this little building was a compass drawing, northeast, southwest, so they could tell which direction it was coming from and where it was going to. Inside was also a red phone. That phone, once you picked it up, connected you directly to Akron military base over in Akron, Ohio. And you would report whatever plane it was, because planes were not that plentiful back then, but you would describe the plane, what you thought it was, and report it. In fact, Columbiana had a blind man that helped out with this. And of course, he couldn't do anything with the silhouettes, but he knew the difference in hearing their engines, and he could tell exactly what type of plane it was from just hearing it. In fact, he could pick up an airplane before it could even be sighted with your eye, that he would hear it from that far away. Later in life, this was torn down in 1959. They tore the whole thing down, but they kept the little top of it and moved it down to the football field and used it as a ticket booth for years and years, actually 40-some years before it was finally gone. The 1953 Octocade was on, and all the synchronized swimmers that were out at the park, this was an annual event out there, and everyone went out. Now it's being augmented. There were comedy skits in between, because a couple of the guys that didn't really want to do the synchronized swimming thing, well, they were just diving off the boards and being goofy. It just entertained the crowds. We're up to the sesquicentennial, and the very first group from Columbiana to put their hat in the ring that they were going to do something special for the sesquicentennial, since it was going to be centered at the park, was the Green Thumb Garden Club. And they had planters put on both sides of the latest pavilion, that number 4 pavilion, on the parking lot side and on the pond side. Not only did they plant them, but they also took care of them the entire year, pinching them and watering them and weeding, and to keep the color and everything looking very nice. That same winter, we had a good snow down at the duck pond. In fact, the ice was getting smaller and smaller because the little tractor couldn't push the snow off to the side. So Carl Spratt, the leader of our street department, chopped a hole in the ice, and he deemed it's safe to put a big tractor on here. It's 7 inches thick. So the big tractor went down, got on top. This is an old 8N with only about a 3-foot bucket width in the front, so it wasn't that big a tractor, but drove right into the bottom of the pond. Jim Firestone, who was riding the tractor at the time, jumped off to safety of the shore, which safety is kind of in perspective, because it sank in a whole 12 inches of water. It didn't even come up to the bottom of the crankcase. That same year, early spring, Russell Firestone came to the park just to see how things were going, and the son of Harvey, and to look over things. He noticed that old barn, if you remember, I pointed that out, was used when we first got it in 1930s. Now it's 20 years later. It had been moved down beside the baseball field and used as a maintenance shack. And he thought it was an eyesore. So he got a hold of his brothers and sister, and they came up with $5,000 and said, get rid of that and build something half decent. This was around March of that year. So by July 4th, there was this brand, whoop, and again. So by March, there was a brand new facility that was put down there, which is a maintenance garage that we still have today. It was built by Bob Ballnoble from the local contractor in Columbiana. And the entire thing cost just under $1,500 for the city. So around $6,500 for the entire building to be put up. And my little thinking wheel is still thinking. Really? There it is. Sting? Thank you. This is the archery course. I don't know if any of you remember where the archery, but there was all an archery / rifle range / golf ball driving range. It was at the northeast corner of the park, outside where the hardball field is, right where the girls softball field is now. The two girls softball fields is where this was located, and they all shot to the east. In the background, you can see the farmhouse that used to be, or the barn that used to belong to this entire thing. That same year, the bypass was put in. The state route used to go through the middle of Columbiana and through the square and out Salem Street, down Park Avenue. Well, Park Avenue intersects Route 14 now and goes up to the northwest where McDonald's is. That bypass was put in 1955. So they can't be shooting any rifles to the east. And because of that, they decided, if I don't knock this off, they decided to get rid of the archery range and also the golf ball driving range at that point. And there were houses that were starting to spring up closer too. So that was another obstacle in their way. The Booster Club that year put a brand new scoreboard up and also the spotters booth, but this was on the visitor side. This is on the north side of the football field where it originally started out. And vandalism has always been part of the park for some reason. It's just the ugly underside of it. This year, kids attacked not only the pool and the office, but this window used to be in our locker room, which was underneath the cement stadium. Those of us that played during that era and changed under there had these windows for ventilation. And they kicked the windows in, and they also got our brand new restrooms and vandalized those that year. The sesquicentennial was going on, and the Hanna family came into town, the descendants of the original Hanna family. This lovely young couple is Rachel Dixon, the daughter of Joshua Dixon, and Benjamin Hanna. And Joshua Dixon owned a whole lot of property in town, and there was a property right where the park is at the top of the hill that had a spring right out the back side of it that they could use for housekeeping. Well, that spring also served all the travelers on Springfield Road, coming to Columbiana or leaving Columbiana. So they built their log cabin. Where exactly, we don't know. Right now, it's been reconstructed with just a chimney that's over there, as far as a place near where the spring was. The Hanna family asked if they could have something similar to what Mr. Firestone had with his big boulder and plaque on it. So the newly formed Columbiana Fairfield Township Historical Society decided this was a great venture, and they took it on. They had hired a geologist from the Youngstown State to look for a similar boulder that they could use for this. They contacted Columbiana Foundry again, and they poured a new plaque for it. This is kind of a thumbnail drawing of the improvements that they wanted to make in that little area. They were going to dig it out, put a little bridge across it, and the plantings even included skunk cabbage, because that was indigenous to the area, or to this area. And at the very end of it, they found stone and none other than the old Hanna farm on New Waterford Road. So they approached that owner, he was gladly donated it, and that's the plaque that's up there in that area. The Hanna family came back. It took about 2 years to accomplish this, and there were 5 descendants of the Hanna family that attended the dedication. don't know if bunnies can swim that well, but the Aquacade this year in 1958 had some kind of bunny costumes going on with it. And as greedy as the park has been over the years, it was decided in '59 to get a little more money out of people. So they this is an old time coin meter. You put a nickel in, you turn the knob in the middle, and you got 15 minutes of electricity. Well, that went over like a lead balloon, because we're paying for the pavilion and to have a reunion there, and now you want us to pay for electric? Come on. Well, it only lasted one summer, and then those were torn out. Perry Kaiser, one of our long-term managers, was part of the National Weather Service. Here is not the best because it's a reprint of a reproduction of a microfilm. Anyway, this little capsule that was across from the bathhouse, he would go out once a week and put a new piece of paper in it, and it would record the temperature, record the precipitation and the humidity and all this. Once a month, he'd put them all in a manila envelope and send it down to Nashville. And he was part of the National Weather Service. Was his jobs at Columbiana was on the map for that. Up to this point, when they had a concession stand at a football game, they just brought a card table out and set it up and put a couple candy bars and maybe a thermos of coffee there. It was decided they wanted something more permanent, so the Booster Club took this on. For $750, they originally built this entire thing. First tried to push it off as saying, oh, the park can use it for the 9 months of the year, and we only need it for 10 weeks, and our football season's over. Don't know that the park ever put anything inside this thing. It's always been concession stand. So now we've come through the first 25 years. This little article, again, you can tell by the number, it's in the upper corner. This is at the Historical Society up in Columbiana, at the square. This is also on microfilm in the library. But this is a great synopsis of the first 25 years that was printed in the Ledger at that time. So over those first 25 years, we not only have the dedication of the park and the complete development of everything, and yeah, there was opposition. Some people said, why are we even building this? Because we can't take care of it if it is built. There were 4 park managers during this time, the latest being Perry Kaiser, who was still the park manager. And the complete development of all 53 acres, and not only just to be developed. I mean, these were selected plants from a world-renowned landscape architect that would put in and strategically placed so they could mature as they have today, the canopy that we have. So as a community, we were given this jewel a long time ago, and it's up to us to preserve it for a lot more future generations. Thank you for bearing with me with all this. I appreciate your afternoon, your attention. And those who are asleep can wake up as you go home.